Hi there, everybody. I am just going to give a brief lecture on the digestive system, and I will post that this weekend along with a few instructions, and then we will plan on meeting on Wednesday to discuss the urinary system and Friday for the reproductive system. So let me share my screen. All right. So chapter 16 is all about the reproductive, or the digestive system, sorry. And when we talk about the digestive system, we divide that into the digestive tract and the accessory organs. So the digestive tract is the GI tract, sometimes called the alimentary canal. It's the tube that runs all the way through us from our mouth to our anus. Um, this is where the food actually is and the nutrients are. We'll see that there are different regions of the digestive tract that are considered different organs. So, for instance, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines. Um, then there are accessory glands. Accessory glands, or accessory organs, I should say, contribute to digestion, but the food is never actually in them, right? So they consider teeth and your tongue, your salivary glands accessory. They're not part of the GI tract. Also, in your uh, abdominal cavity is your gallbladder, your liver, and your pancreas. So there are 6 functions of the digestive system. Ingestion, just when you take food in. Mechanical processing, that's just breaking down food into smaller pieces, mainly with your teeth and your tongue and your mouth, right? You're chewing the food, you're breaking it into smaller pieces. Digestion is chemical breakdown. So that's when you actually add enzymes, which break down the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the proteins into smaller molecules. And this whole time, what you're doing is secreting liquid into the food. You're secreting water, you're secreting salivary juices, right? Saliva. You're secreting gastric juices, you're secreting things from your pancreas, we'll see. Then in your small intestine, you're going to absorb those nutrients. So the whole point of your digestive system is to get nutrients into your body, right? To get things like glucose and proteins into your body that you need. And once you digest things in your stomach and your small intestines, you're going to absorb into your bloodstream a lot of those nutrients for necessary functions in your body, which we'll talk about. And then finally, anything that's not absorbed is defecated. So here is just a picture showing major organs of the digestive tract. As I said, they consider different regions of the digestive tract organs. And then on the right here are the accessory organs. So remember, the food is never actually in the accessory organs. So we'll start with the digestive tract. And the first thing to talk about is the lining of the digestive tract. It plays a very big defensive role. You can think about the fact that you could ingest food that has something like bacteria on it. There are bacteria that live in our digestive tract. And so this layer is preventing those bacteria from getting into our bloodstream. Right? It also is protective in that anything moving through a digestive tract, which can be corrosive, like your stomach acid, is protected from getting into your tissues. And anything which could be abrasive going through our digestive tract is also protected from our tissues. So no matter where you cut through the GI tract, there are 4 layers. There is the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. And I'm going to go to this diagram. So this could be a cut through any region of the digestive tract, esophagus, stomach, small intestines. You always have the innermost layer, which is in contact with the food. It's called mucosa. Outside of that is the submucosa. You can see red and blue here. That's because the submucosa is where you have blood vessels and nerves. Outside the submucosa is the muscularis externa, right? Usually it's 2 layers of muscle. that help you propel food through your digestive tract. And then the outer layer is called the serosa, that is more just protective again. And the serosa oftentimes is attached to different parts of your abdominal wall. And what we'll see as we move through the different organs of the digestive tract, the mucosa is different in different organs. So it's different in the esophagus than it is in the stomach than it is in the small intestines. So we'll start at the top, start with the oral cavity. It's also called the buccal cavity because we have a muscle on either side of our mouth called the buccinator. It is lined by the mucosa. In this case, it's called oral mucosa. It's lined with stratified squamous epithelium. That's like the same thing that's on our skin. That serves as a barrier so things don't get into our body. This is where you have teeth, tongue, gingiva, or gums. This is where a lot of accessory organs are. And so a big part of this is mechanically processing food, right? We also have the ability to sense food before we swallow it. We have taste buds, right? We have to add saliva and mucus to the food that will help it move through our digestive tract. And it's at this point that we begin digestion. There are enzymes in our saliva that help us to start breaking down carbohydrates and lipids. Not proteins, just carbohydrates and lipids. So here is a picture of the oral cavity. Here again is the epiglottis, which will flop down and cover up your trachea so that food can only move down the esophagus. We saw that in the respiratory system as well. And so what do we have in that oral cavity? We have our tongue, which is made of skeletal muscle, means we can move that around voluntarily. Our tongue does have tonsils on it, which are areas of lymphoid tissue, lymphatic tissue, to help fight against infection. The major role of the tongue is just to manipulate food, so to move it back and forth between your teeth so that you can grind it up into smaller pieces. But it does have the ability to sense the food. So not just your taste buds, but also touch and temperature. You can feel the temperature of the food. In your mouth, you have 3 sets of salivary glands. You have parotids, sublinguals, and submandibulars. The parotids are on kind of the cheek up by the ear. Here's a picture here. Sublingual are below the tongue. Submandibular are below the jaw. They all contribute saliva to the food, which is going to help to moisten the food, lubricate it, to help pass it through your digestive system. Saliva also contains a couple of enzymes. It contains something called amylase, which helps break down carbohydrates. And your saliva contains lingual lipase, which helps break down lipids. The teeth perform chewing, right? They are breaking the food into smaller layers, smaller pieces. And then behind the mouth is what we have a chamber called the pharynx. And we saw this in the respiratory system as well, because part of the pharynx is behind the nose, parts behind the mouth. So it's a common passageway for food, liquid, and air. Food only passes through the oropharynx and laryngopharynx. It doesn't ever go up to the nasopharynx. And it's going to go down through the esophagus, right? So when you're swallowing food, when you're moving it to the back of your throat, when you're moving it to the back of your throat, what happens is your your epiglottis flops down and covers up your trachea. Your uvula moves back and blocks off your nasopharynx, and food and drink can only go down the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube that leads down to the stomach, so it's just another region of the GI tract. It has those same 4 layers. It's considered a separate organ. This is where at the top of the esophagus you have skeletal muscle, and as you get closer and closer to the stomach, it's more smooth muscle, which just means that you have control of the food when you're swallowing it into your esophagus. as it starts to move down your esophagus, you don't have voluntary control of it. It is located just behind the trachea, and it enters your stomach, what's called the lower esophageal sphincter. Right? The lower esophageal sphincter is between the esophagus and the stomach, and it protects against gastric backflow. So when you have a lot of stomach acid, which has a very low pH, and what you want to do is protect that stomach acid from getting up into your esophagus. So you have a ring of circular muscle where the esophagus meets the stomach called the lower esophageal sphincter. The upper esophageal sphincter is up at the top of the esophagus. The lower one's at the bottom of the esophagus. And that's going to prevent gastric backflow, which is the same as heartburn or indigestion, right? Or acid reflux. And so its job is just to prevent a lot of that stomach acid from getting up into your esophagus. When we get to the stomach, what are some primary functions of the stomach? It's temporary storage of ingested food. We'll see that it takes only about 20 minutes for the food to get to the stomach. It takes several hours from the stomach to empty. While it's in the stomach, food is getting mechanically broken down. So the stomach is constantly churning and it's breaking the food down into smaller pieces. And then there's some chemical digestion going on, both by stomach acid and enzymes. So your stomach makes hydrochloric acid, which is really strong acid, which helps to break down some of the things mechanically, but it also helps to break down proteins chemically. And there's also an enzyme called pepsin, which helps break down proteins chemically. So in the mouth, you had some chemical breakdown of carbohydrates and lipids. In the stomach, you have some chemical breakdown of proteins. At this point, the mixture of food plus the contents of the stomach is called chyme, right? So it's like partially digested food plus saliva plus, HCl plus hydrochloric acid plus stomach contents. It's very acidic. And here are the regions of the stomach. The top region where the esophagus connects is called the cardia. The bulge over that is called the fundus, and I'll show you this on a picture in a minute. Most of the stomach is called the body, and then the end where the stomach meets the small intestine is called the pylorus. At that end of the stomach, there's also a ring of muscle called the pyloric sphincter that regulates how much chyme leaves the stomach to get into the small intestine. The stomach itself, mucosa, like I said, the mucosa is different in the different regions of the digestive tract. So the stomach has folds called rugae, and the folds are just there to increase surface area. So the stomach can kind of stretch to accommodate more food or more drink. The muscularis of the stomach is unique in that it has a third layer, right? So all of the digestive tract has a circular and a longitudinal layer of muscle. The stomach also has an oblique layer, which strengthens the stomach wall and assists it to mix and turn the food. And then the stomach has two mesenteries that are going to kind of attach the stomach to other organs to hold it in place. So I'm gonna just kind of zoom in this a little bit. So here is your esophagus where it comes into the stomach. That's called the cardia. This bulge that goes above the cardia is the fundus. The majority of the stomach is the body. The pylorus is the end here where it meets the small intestine. This is where the pyloric sphincter is, right? So the lower esophageal sphincter is here. Pyloric sphincter is here. You can see the omentum. It's called the lesser omentum and the greater omentum, which attach to different organs. You can see the stomach is cut open, and you can see all the folds called the rugae, which are the folds in the mucosa. And the stomach itself has 3 layers of muscle. So here you can see the cut through the wall of the stomach, right? The mucosa has all the folds called the rugae. Here's your submucosa. Your muscularis of your stomach has 3 layers of muscle, and then the serosa. In between those layers, or in between the folds, the rugae and the mucosa, are what are called gastric pits, right? Just the depressions in between each of those folds. And that's where gastric glands are. So they are producing what's called gastric juice, which is the combination of hydrochloric acid and pepsin, which becomes pepsinogen, which breaks down proteins. In the stomach, you are breaking down proteins. You are not absorbing any nutrients. You don't absorb anything in the stomach. Right? So you do have parietal cells and chief cells. Parietal cells secrete intrinsic factor and hydrochloric acid, and chief cells secrete pepsinogen, which becomes pepsin, which breaks down proteins. And there are 3 phases of this gastric activity of how it's regulated. There's the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. If we look at those words, cephalic means head. So this is the phase that is when you sense food in your mouth, even sometimes when you just smell food, you start producing some of those stomach gastric juices in preparation for food. The gastric phase is when food actually gets to the stomach and it stretches. And then the intestinal phase is when the chyme now starts leaving the stomach, go into the intestine. So digestion in the stomach, where we had in the mouth, we had salivary amylase and lipase to start breaking down carbohydrates. When they get to the stomach, they stop functioning because of the low pH of the stomach. But the pH of the stomach initiates proteins to start being digested. And then partially broken down nutrients leave the stomach to go to the small intestine. There is no absorption in the stomach. No nutrients get absorbed. So then we get to the small intestine. This is where a lot of stuff happens. It's the major site of both digestion and absorption. The small intestine is divided into 3 segments called the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. They are not equal. They're not 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Right? The duodenum is actually just the first kind of turn, the first foot or so of the small intestine, from where it leaves the stomach through the first turn that we'll see. Then the majority of the small intestine is the jejunum and the ileum. The whole point is that what you are going to try to do in the duodenum is completely digest all of your nutrients. So you've started some of the digestion in the mouth and the stomach, but you want to completely digest the rest of the nutrients in the duodenum, so that as this chyme moves through the jejunum and the ileum, you can absorb the nutrients from it. Right? So you want to get the nutrients broken down into their smallest pieces in that first part of the small intestine, so that as this mixture travels through your intestines, you can absorb more nutrients from it. So the jejunum and the ileum are the longer segments. Those are where you're doing a lot of absorption, right? So here's your small intestine. What they've done is they've removed the stomach. The stomach would be right here. So this blue part, the duodenum, you can see is the smallest part, the shortest part of your small intestine. You're going to try to completely digest food there, completely break food down into its smallest nutrients, so that in this purple region, the jejunum, and the pink region, the ileum, you can absorb those nutrients. The intestine, the mucosa of the intestine is different than that of the stomach. You have these circular folds, which at first glance look similar to the stomach. They're called villi. They're each one's a villus, They look like finger-like extensions, and each villus has a blood source in it and a lacteal in it. So what I'm going to show you here is the section through the stomach, through the small intestine. We've got mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. And notice in the mucosa you have these villi, right? Each one of those is a villus. And what they've done over here to the right is they've just shown you one. Inside each villus is blood vessels, right? The blue and red are capillary. And the green is called a lacteal. That's part of your lymphatic system. So the chyme is out here, right? The chyme would be inside your small intestine. The nutrients from the completely broken down, completely digested food, those nutrients are going to diffuse across this layer of cells. Look, it's only one layer of cells, and get into your capillaries. That's how we get things like glucose and amino acids into our bloodstream. They diffuse across this layer and get into the capillaries. The one thing that's too big to get into the capillaries are fats from the foods we eat. Fats from the food we eat tend to be really large, even once they're broken down. So they have to get into this green capillary called a lacteal, which is part of your lymphatic system. So that's going to lead to a lymphatic vessel. And we know from our lymphatic system that eventually just meets back up with the bloodstream. The only way to get dietary fats into your bloodstream is to absorb them into a lacteal, and for the lacteal to then bring them back to your bloodstream. So most of your important digestive processes are completed in the beginning of your small intestine, the duodenum. Right? This is where we have our pancreas, our liver, and our gallbladder leading into that first turn. Those three accessory organs, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, are going to contribute to digestion. Now here we can see this picture. Here's our small intestine. This is the duodenum, the beginning of it. This is the pancreas. Our stomach would be here attached to the small intestine. This is our liver, and green is our gallbladder. So the first thing to talk about is the pancreas. Well, the pancreas secretes pancreatic enzymes through this duct. It goes right through the middle, and it goes into our duodenum. Pancreas is making enzymes that will help us break down, it will completely break down carbohydrates, lipids, and protein. So we started breaking down some of those already. What we want to do is break down the rest of them, right? Completely break them down. And if you look at where this pancreatic duct enters the small intestine, there's also a bile duct entering at that same location, right? And if you look up here, that bile duct is coming from the gallbladder. This green organ called the gallbladder is the one that stores what's called bile. Bile helps you break down fats. It actually doesn't chemically break them down. It just breaks them into smaller pieces. So we are secreting into the beginning of our small intestine, we're secreting bile, which is going to help mechanically break down fats. And we're secreting pancreatic enzymes, which will chemically break down fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. The other thing that the pancreas does is it secretes something called sodium bicarbonate. I'll go back to this for a second. So what's happening in your intestine is chyme is leaving the stomach right here and coming into the intestine. And we know the stomach has a pH around 2. It's very acidic. We want to neutralize that acid, right? The acid can burn our intestine. So along with our digestive enzymes, what you're secreting is a solution that will balance that pH. It will raise the pH back to neutral, right? Just because the pH of the stomach is so low. And so what your stomach does is it only allows a little bit of chyme to enter your small intestine at a time so that your pancreas can neutralize it, right? And then once that moves a little further, your stomach will allow a little more chyme to enter. That's why it takes a long time for your stomach to empty, because you're only allowing a little bit of chyme out at a time. What's controlling that regulation is that pyloric sphincter. The sphincter that's at this end of the stomach is controlling how much chyme gets into the small intestine. And there's a list of the pancreatic enzymes and what they do. Okay, the other digestive organ that is an accessory digestive organ that is in the abdominal cavity is the liver. Now, you can see this is the liver from the front. This is it from the back. The gallbladder is right there on the back side of the liver. The liver actually produces the bile, which gets stored in the gallbladder. Okay, so the liver is producing that bile. But what the liver does is something even bigger than that. So in your small intestine, all through your jejunum and your ileum, you have a lot of capillaries, a lot of blood vessels. And those blood vessels are absorbing anything that you ate or drank that got into your small intestine. Some of that's good, some of it's bad. So you don't want to just take those blood vessels and dump all that blood back into your heart, right? It's conceivable that you could have eaten or drank something that had a toxin. So your liver's role is to filter all of that blood. So the large amount of blood that is coming from the small intestine, all of those capillaries that are coming from the small intestine, travel to the liver through what's called the hepatic portal vein. Right there. And your liver is going to filter those. Right? Your liver is going to filter all of that blood. And when it filters out, the clean blood goes through the hepatic vein and into the inferior vena cava, go back up to your heart. In other words, you don't just go straight from your small intestines back up to your heart. You travel or you filter that blood through your liver first, so your liver can take out and filter any toxins. Right? What actually does the filtering is the portal triad. There is in each triad, so there's a bunch of sections of these triads. There's a hepatic portal vein, a hepatic artery, and the branch of the bile duct. So as blood comes in from the hepatic artery to hepatic portal vein, it goes through these hepatocytes, which filter the blood. Right? And that's the liver's major function. Now, there are other functions of the liver. It regulates metabolism. It produces bile, right? So there's a lot of issues with liver injury or infection. But one of the major things that it does is it filters all of that blood coming from the small intestine. As I said before, it does produce bile. Bile gets stored in your gallbladder, where it just kind of gets concentrated as it sits there. And it breaks down fats by a process called emulsification. And that's just mechanical breakdown. That's just breaking them down into smaller pieces. Then we get to the large intestine. So there's a lot going on in the small intestine. Hopefully, you have completely digested your chyme at the duodenum and then absorbed a lot of those nutrients through the jejunum and the ileum. The large intestine's major role is to absorb water. From the time you put food into your mouth, you're secreting things into it, right? Water, saliva. As it gets to your stomach, there's contents of your stomach that get secreted into it. As it gets to your small intestine, you're secreting more contents into it. So you need to reabsorb a lot of that. The large intestine goes from the end of the small intestine, which is the ileum, all the way to the anus, right? Its main function is reabsorbing water. There are some vitamins that get reabsorbed at this point. But here's a picture of your large intestine. So your small intestine is all coiled up in here. Here's the ileum. Here's the end of your small intestine. It meets the large intestine at a region called the cecum. Okay, and so this valve where those two regions meet is called the ileocecal valve because it's where the ileum meets the cecum. By the way, that's where your appendix is. Your appendix is sticking off of the cecum. Your large intestine is also called your colon. So this is the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and then the S shape is the sigmoid colon, which leads to the rectum. So the chyme enters through the ileocecal valve, and that's where you start compacting this chyme. That's where the appendix is, right? The appendix contains some lymphoid tissue, and some people end up with inflammation of the appendix called appendicitis. Some people even have to have it removed. The colon is the majority of your large intestine, sorry. It does have these pouches that allow the colon to expand and get longer called haustra. And it has longitudinal bands of smooth muscle, extra smooth muscle, that are called tenia coli. And then the colon ends at the digestive tract. Ends at the rectum, sorry. The rectum leads to the anus. The rectum is an expandable organ for storing feces temporarily. The anal canal is the last portion. The anus has an internal and an external sphincter. The internal one is involuntary, the external is voluntary. And the major function of the large intestine is to reabsorb water. You're reabsorbing about 1.5 liters of water each day. What happens if you eat a toxin? You end up with diarrhea and you get dehydrated really fast. And what's happening is the chyme is moving through your large intestine too quickly, not quick enough or not slow enough, I'm sorry, for you to reabsorb water. And so by moving through your intestine too quickly, you're losing a ton of water. That's why the danger of something like severe diarrhea from something like dysentery or something that you might get, that you might get some sort of food poisoning that you might get, is that you get dehydrated really quickly, right? So you need to rehydrate constantly if you have diarrhea, and that's the reason why, because you're moving things through your large intestine so fast, you're not holding on to any of the water. I'm gonna let that go there. And what I'm going to say is that I'll post this today along with some other instructions. And so please continue to do your respiratory physiology. I'll post some instructions about the dissection of the fetal pig. And what we'll do is we'll meet on Wednesday and talk about the urinary system, and we'll start the reproductive system and finish that on Friday. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.